On this retreat, for the most part in the evenings, we've been looking at suttas on the Buddha's life and taking a fresh look at some of the events that's recorded in the earliest text for the Buddha. And these texts being, I believe, probably the few details that we learn about the Buddha's biography, certainly before he was enlightened. There is of course, a wealth of other material which we haven't covered. And in fact, since virtually every sutta is presented by the Buddha or somehow in relation to the Buddha, then we could consider that every sutta is an episode in the Buddha's life in one way or another. Of course, most suttas dealing with doctrinal teachings or meditation teachings and so on, so it doesn't necessarily reveal a lot about the Buddha's, the details of his life. But still, throughout the suttas, we have a lot of things that tell us what kind of person that he was and what kind of. Sorry, did you have a question? What kind of? No, sorry. Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah, go on. Right. Okay. No, it's not normal. It's unusual. My guess is it's got nothing to do with meditation, but try it again, and if you find that it persists, then get back to me. All right? Sure. Oh, we didn't get that far. What is the sixth sense? Oh, the mind. Like I said, we're just baby steps, all right? When you can do those, the five senses are easy. When you can do those ones, then the mind will be easy. Don't worry about it just for now. Yeah. Simple introductory meditation, huh? So not covering everything. Okay, so we've been looking at the Buddha's life story and at some of the events, the formative events that he referred to later in his life that describe what were the things that shaped the man and the teacher that he was to become. Last we looked at the Buddha's birth, we looked at the events that happened to him when he was growing up, we looked at his practice under his former teachers, and last night we looked at the night before last, now we looked at his progress in meditation and how he overcame various difficulties in his meditation. Luckily, he did in fact overcome those difficulties, and he got enlightened. And the story goes that he, after we've already seen the episode where he reflected on the fact that he did jhana as a child and then determined this is the path to awakening. So he then, because before that he'd been fasting very excessively and his body was very emaciated, so he took some solid food, and then he crossed the Naranja River at the town that we know today as Bodh Gaya, and in those days known as Uruvela, and near the town there was a magnificent Bodhi, what we call today Bodhi tree, and the Bodhi tree is a traditional sacred tree in India, and it was sacred long before the Buddha. It's mentioned in the Vedas, and it's also represented in the artwork from the Indus Valley 1,000 years before the Buddha. with a goddess embodied in the Bodhi tree. So this was a sacred tree that was worshipped, and probably would have been a shrine there, some cleared ground. And the Buddha thought, oh, it's a beautiful place to meditate. So he went and sat under the tree. And presumably after some period of meditation and so on, he became enlightened. The account goes that he spent the whole night in meditation and realized the different kinds of insight during that night, and then became enlightened with the rising of the dawn. So for today, I won't read too much in detail about that whole process, but I will read the verse that is traditionally said to have been the first thing that the Buddha uttered after his enlightenment. So it's the song of celebration by the Buddha after he realized the ending of all his defilements. And this particular verse is found in the Dhammapada, in the chapter on old age, chapter 11 of the Dhammapada. And I've just recently completed my translation of this text. And so everybody has translated the Dhammapada. There's probably 100 or so translations of it. So it's one of those things that's quite, it's an interesting challenge because it's not easy. It's not an easy text to translate. And being verse, then it poses its own set of problems. But also it's an interesting one to translate because the verses of the Dhammapada are so common and so popular that they, whether you like it or not, they're kind of echoing around inside your mind when you're reading the Pali. So you want to try to make sure that you not unduly influenced by past translators. At the same time, though, many of those past translators have done a pretty good job, and so you don't want to just get rid of good ideas and good renderings that have been done in the past just to do something new, different for the sake of it. Anyway, so I tried my best to translate this. So this verse, this chapter, begins with one of my favorite verses, and I'm going to read that. It's got nothing to do with what we're talking about, but I'm going to read it anyway because I like it. So when you're teaching, you can make up the rules, all right? What is joy, what is laughter when the flames are ever burning? Shrouded by darkness, would you not seek a light? Another one is another one which I like. A person of little learning ages like an ox. Their flesh grows, but not their wisdom. So Dhammapada is full of these little when young they spurned the spiritual path and failed to earn any wealth. Now they languish like old cranes in a pond bereft of fish. Anyway, so the particular verses, so the Dhammapada is like a collection of verses organized according to themes, but the chapters, which each have a particular theme, there's not necessarily any connection between the verses in those chapters. It's just mostly isolated verses. Some of them, sometimes 2 or 3 of the verses are connected, but for the most part, they're individual verses collected under those themes. So the famous verse spoken by the Buddha after his awakening begins with the phrase Aneka Jati Sangsarang. So here's my translation. Transmigrating through countless rebirths. I almost read that as translating through countless rebirths. Feels like that sometimes. Transmigrating through countless rebirths, I've journeyed without reward. Searching for the house builder, painful is birth again and again. I've seen you, house builder. You won't build a house again. Your rafters are all broken. Your roof peak is demolished. My mind set on demolition has reached the end of craving. So I'll read these verses again. Transmigrating through countless rebirths, I've journeyed without reward, searching for the house builder. Painful is birth again and again. I've seen you, house builder. You won't build a house again. Your rafters are all broken. Your roof peak is demolished. My mind, set on demolition, has reached the end of craving. Okay, so these... This is a very kind of powerful set of verses and a very kind of strong sentiment that the Buddha is expressing here. And clearly he's framing his enlightenment in the context of being freed from rebirth. So to understand what he's saying here, then we have to consider a little bit about the concept of rebirth and how it applies in Buddhism. Now, rebirth has become a little bit of a controversial topic in certain quarters of modern Buddhism, where some people argue that the Buddha didn't really teach about rebirth, that it's a Hindu teaching, and so on and so forth. I don't think any of those things are true. The Buddha certainly did teach rebirth, and it certainly was a central and important part of his teaching, as we see in these verses and countless other places throughout the suttas. Obviously, not everybody believes in rebirth. And a lot of people think, well, here we are, we've got our bodies, and the mind or consciousness certainly has a close relationship with our bodies, undeniably. And you can chop somebody's head off and they stop being conscious, we presume. Try it and see. And so there is a... don't try it. That was a joke. Don't try it. Don't even think about it. No, not even a little bit. No. Okay, so, but we have these like brains which have got all this kind of gooey stuff inside our heads, and we know from all kinds of experiments and illnesses and things like that the brains have a very intimate role to play with consciousness and how we're aware. And clearly, when the body dies, then it seems there's a close relationship between that and consciousness disappearing, and it's hard to find any evidence of consciousness after death. It's hard to find any evidence of consciousness anyway, and no, that's not a joke about politics. But it's not. Where was it? It's hard to find evidence. To be. How do we know that other people are conscious? This is a hard problem in philosophy. It's really difficult to show that, really what we do is we introspect, and we know that somehow we're conscious, and we kind of assume that if we look in the mirror, right, I look like a person. And if I look around me, I see these other things that look vaguely like persons as well, and they kind of act in recognizably similar ways to I do. So we kind of assume that other people have something inside them that's more or less the same as something that's inside me. Right? Exactly, it's an inference, right? So we don't really, for the most part, see directly. At least we don't see that consciously. I'm certainly open to the idea that we or subconsciously or subtly interact with and are aware of people's minds in a more direct way, right? But it's not something that's really easy to prove or get any hard evidence for. So we tend to infer the existence of other minds from people's behavior and so on and so forth. It's the simplest explanation. in computer science, of course, they had the famous what they call the Turing Test, which is how do you test whether a computer is conscious or whether a robot is conscious. And again, it's a very, very hard question to answer. The Turing Test was proposed by the great one of the founders of computer science, Alan Turing, who argued what is essentially a behavioralist point of view, which says that if a computer behaves well enough to appear as if it's conscious, then for all intents and purposes, we have to act as if it is conscious. And the basic idea of the Turing test is if you can have a conversation with a computer and not know that it's a computer, then that's basically passing the Turing test. And that's an astonishingly low bar for consciousness, and it's still interesting that computers are still unable to pass that test in any meaningful form. Whether they will or not, I'm not sure, but I don't think that Turing test actually tells us anything at all about consciousness. One of the things that is often overlooked in discussions about the Turing test is that in the original paper that Alan Turing wrote, where he talked about this Turing test, he acknowledged the possibility of being able to read people's minds. He acknowledged the possibility of telepathy. I don't think he believed in it as such, but he acknowledged that it was possible, and that if it was possible to have telepathy, then that would provide the only better way of directly accessing the consciousness of others. So that's kind of interesting, isn't it? So, all right, so consciousness is kind of hard to know and hard to tell. So we make all these assumptions about consciousness that somehow consciousness derives from matter. And this is kind of the most common thesis that you get in materialist circles these days, that the only fundamental substance in the world, the only thing that really exists, is matter. And that when matter is organized in a way that's sufficiently complicated and sufficiently sophisticated, like a brain, for example, then it will give rise to what we call consciousness. This is that theory. And so the idea is that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of matter. And this particular theory is rife with philosophical problems. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not a scientific theory, even though it's a theory which is often held to be associated with science. But science can't prove this theory. I don't even know that science can meaningfully inquire into this theory. It's a philosophical theory which depends on an interpretation of events and which depends on a certain way of seeing the world. Among other philosophical problems, of the many philosophical problems with this kind of idea, for example, if consciousness is an epiphenomenon of matter, then doesn't that not mean that consciousness in somehow is superfluous? I mean, what role does consciousness do? It just sort of happens to pop up into existence, and it's just kind of there. What is it actually doing? It's just like floating around on top of matter without actually affecting it all. So this is kind of one philosophical problem that materialists have to grapple with. And of course there are many others, but the root philosophical problem, the deep philosophical problem, is that theory tells us precisely nothing about consciousness itself. It tells us nothing about what it is like to be aware. And there was a famous philosophical paper on this in the 1970s. It was published called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" Sorry? Right, yeah. Was it John Nagel? Anyway, yeah. And so he was trying to point to this idea of this subjectivity of experience, pointing out that because a bat's sensory apparatus is so different from ours that it's very difficult for us to imagine ourselves into the situation of being like a bat. And so I was pointing to this, I try to use this as a way of getting to that notion of subjectivity. And that idea of subjectivity of experience, like the heart of consciousness, is fundamental to the Indian philosophies, starting with the Upanishads. There's a constant concern for knowing what is the knower. And Yajnavalkya in the Upanishads is always saying the unseen seer, the unheard hearer, the unthought thinker, the unknown knower. What is it that knows all of these things but isn't known by them? And of course Yajnavalkya, as an Upanishadic philosopher, would say that is yourself. And if we are to ask what is that self that is pointing to, he said that self is vijnana gahanameva, a sheer mass of consciousness. So this pure subjective awareness, which is the divine reality of the cosmos, from which all things arise and into which all things will return. And so that's the subjectivity of consciousness has been fundamental to Indian philosophy since that time. And the Buddha shared that concern with the subjectivity of consciousness, and he used some interesting similes to try to convey that idea. For example, one simile he talks about consciousness as being like the lord of the city, who sits in the middle of the city at the crossroads. And the city has 6 gates, and those 6 gates, of course, being the 6 senses. And a swift pair of messengers will approach through those gates, and that swift pair of messengers being samatha or tranquility and vipassana or insight. And that swift pair of messengers will come and deliver the message of truth to the lord of the city who's sitting in the middle at the crossroads. That's a very powerful and very interesting simile. That idea of consciousness of being that which sits in the middle and knows all of what's happening around. I believe consciousness is not an epiphenomenon, and I believe it's not something which is, strictly speaking, derived from matter, nor so I reject monistic philosophy of materialism. Monists, since they often come up from the Western philosophical tradition, tend to assume that the opposite of that monistic philosophy is a dualistic philosophy. And dualistic philosophy, most famously propounded by Descartes, but with roots back to the Bible or back to Socrates, essentially propounds that the mind and matter are 2 different substances. So you have 2 different kinds of thing in the world, physical things and mental things. And these things are combined while a person is alive and separated when a person dies. The problem with this philosophy is that how do you actually connect these things? What is it that brings them together? How do they relate to each other? What is the evidence for these 2 separate things or these 2 separate substances? So Buddhism is not a dualistic philosophy. And one of the differences between early Buddhism and later Buddhism is that this kind of dualistic ideas crept into later forms of Buddhism. And you find frequently in modern texts on Buddhism, you find frequently the phrase mind and body or mind and matter. And that phrase or that term doesn't occur anywhere in the early texts. There's no phrase in the Pali Canon that corresponds with the idea of mind and body. On the contrary, what you have is a phrase, for example, like saviññāna kaya, which means the conscious body. The conscious body. In other words, these are not separate things. So what was the Buddha's point of view? If there's not these separate mind and separate body, what is the Buddha's point of view? Well, I hinted at this a little bit earlier in one of the previous talks when I said that the fundamental reality in Buddhism is relation. Chakuncha paticca rupecha upajati chaku viññānaṃ tirnaṃ sangati passo. Dependent on the eye and forms arises eye consciousness. The coming together of the 3 is contact. Dependent of contact, there's feeling, and so on and so forth. This is the basic analysis of experience in Buddhism. Depending on the ear and sounds arises ear consciousness. The coming together of the three is contact. So our basic sense experience, which is what I was trying to point you all towards during the meditation just earlier, this basic sense experience is a complex. It's already a bunch of different stuff happening, and a bunch of different, and all the things that are happening are all impermanent. They're all conditioned. They're all processes. Sights are impermanent. They're an energy, right? The sights arise from photons. Photons are a certain kind of electromagnetic radiation. They have a certain energy to them. These are impermanent. They're changing. The Buddha described them once as being like tottering and falling, like the sights are tottering and falling. The eye is tottering and falling and collapsing. Eye consciousness is tottering and falling and collapsing. Eye contact is tottering and falling and collapsing. All of these things are falling apart all the time. And each one of these senses that builds up the world is like that. It's this complex of conditions which requires an incredibly complex and sophisticated set of structures to make it work. I mean, you need an eye to be able to see, you need an ear to be able to hear, and you need the whole kind of brain and processing apparatus and all of this kind of stuff, and you need like millions of years of evolution in order to figure out how to do all that stuff. These things are complicated. And all of those conditions are necessary in order to be able to sustain these things, and they go so quickly. It's so easy to lose one's sight, to lose one's hearing. Yeah? And if any of the many delicate conditions that go into making these things possible is to fail, then those things will fail, and there won't be that experience. So the primary reality of our experience, of our lives, the primary reality is a complex of conditions, all of which are impermanent, all of which are changing, all of which are not self, they're out of our control, and it's just this kind of mass of sand which is collapsing all around us all the time. These things are energies and processes, they're not things, they're not substances. And the entirety of Buddhist philosophy is against the idea of a substance. There's no thing that underlies everything or underlies experience. The primary reality is the experience. And so anything that we talk about apart from experience is something that we infer and we draw out from that experience. So we can look at that experience, what is hearing like, and we can say that, oh, well, actually, there's some kind of physical component to that. You know, we can locate, for example, if you hear a hearing, you can hear that it's over there. You can hear a sound, right? So it has some kind of physicality to it. And we know that there's like a biological and organic component. We know that that biological and organic component can be at least partially replaced by electronics, right? To some degree. It's not that particular configuration of hearing is not really necessary, but something like that is necessary in order to make it possible to hear. And so this whole complex of things has got to be there. So we know that there's a physical aspect, but we also know that there's a mental aspect to that as well. We know that there's an experience of the sound, what a sound is like. And again, this is what we were pointing to in this meditation exercise we did before, was to try to see something of the different qualities of those senses. And the Buddha compared the six senses to being like 6 animals. And he said what sense experience is like is if you've got and I can't remember exactly what the animals are, it's like you've got a crocodile and a jackal and a snake and a bird and a dog, and you tie them all up in a bundle and you leave them on the street. And you say, just deal with it, guys. And that's what our experience is, and all of these different things. And because our mind is so powerful, our mind is constantly processing all of this stuff and making sense out of it for us. So we imagine that the world makes sense. And when you're sitting there seeing me and my lips moving, and you're hearing a sound, and that sound's going into your mind, and there's an idea in your head that Bhante Sujato is talking, but that's just something that you're making up in your head. What's really happening is much more sinister. What's really happening is that there is a process going on in this mind, which is being expressed in this brain and activated in these electrochemical systems here that's activating certain muscles and so on, and those muscles cause this voice boxy thing here to vibrate in a certain way, creating patterns of pressure in the air where there is higher density and lower density in the air. And those patterns of higher density and lower density in the air propagate, and those patterns hit little bits of skin inside your ears and make them vibrate, and then make the bones inside those ears vibrate, and then stimulate various electrochemical reactions that go into your brains, which means that a little bit of my mind has just entered your mind. All right? Okay, so that's weird. So this is what we do. Our minds and our consciousness and ourselves, who we are, is always leaky. It's always blurring into that of others. Okay, so this idea that the fundamental reality is this complex of conditions, which is processes that are boiling and changing and tottering all the time, and that anything like mind and matter and all of those things are inferences that we make from that, but they're not fundamental substances from a Buddhist point of view. Okay, so that's a kind of a general philosophy of Buddhism, and why Buddhism doesn't fall into the idea of being a monistic philosophy, like a materialist philosophy, nor into a dualistic philosophy. So it doesn't mean that we can't use these modes of analysis. Okay, I mean, you can analyze things as being mind and body if you like, as long as you don't assume that these are fundamental substances. That's the problem. Okay, so again to come back to Philip. Yeah. Sure. Sure. Yeah, I wasn't trying to. Well, the point of that wasn't to prove that the monistic philosophy is wrong, but the point is to illustrate what's actually happening from a Buddhist point of view about how we're relating to each other. That we're not just we don't exist in isolation. That was the point of that story. But you're quite right. Yeah. Okay, so where were we? We were with rebirth and materialism. Right. Okay, so the point here, just to sum up this bit of a digression, but to sum up this digression is that to assume that we are nothing but matter is a reasonable assumption based on the bulk of the evidence that we have, i.e. when people are alive, they're conscious, and when they're dead, they're not conscious. And that's a fairly widespread phenomenon. Right? Now, you can argue that, well, there are exceptions to that, and you can look at things like memories of past lives, and you can look at things like near-death experiences, and so on and so forth, and that's a fascinating field of research, and I think there's something to those things. However, I think it's not unreasonable for somebody to say, well, look, okay, there is that evidence and so on, but compared to the kind of the mass of stuff which says that when you die you stop being conscious, then that's better off treated as being a few exceptions or whatever, which aren't really that well grounded. So I think if somebody wants to say they hold a materialist point of view and they don't believe in rebirth for that reason, I think that's perfectly reasonable. I don't have an argument with that, right? I don't personally believe that, but I think it's a reasonable position to hold. However, what I do find very annoying, and this is a great thing to remember, anybody, if you want to annoy me at any point. What I do find very annoying is when people read this idea back into the suttas and then say, well, therefore the Buddha didn't believe in rebirth. So just because you personally don't believe in rebirth doesn't mean that the Buddha didn't believe in it. And this is annoying not only because it's so bleeding obvious that the Buddha did believe in rebirth, but even more insidious is the problem that there's somehow an assumption that there's something wrong with disagreeing with the Buddha. It's okay. You can disagree with the Buddha, okay? The Buddha didn't mind, all right? And the suttas are full of dialogues and conversations where people would come up and they say, oh, look, you said this and I don't agree with that for this reason, and they would have a conversation about it. The Buddha was fine if people disagreed with him. However, the Buddha also got very annoyed. Well, I don't think he probably got annoyed, really, but he really didn't like it when people misrepresented what he said. And if somebody misrepresented what the Buddha said, then he would come down on them very strongly. Okay, especially something which he said very clearly and many, many times. So again, just to be clear, if you personally don't believe in rebirth, if you're agnostic about it, I think that's a reasonable position. I do think that it's worth taking an interest in the studies on past life memories and so on, because I personally find that quite startling evidence. But if you still reject that, I think that's fine. But it's okay that you disagree with the Buddha. So, the Buddha obviously believed in rebirth, and his spiritual practice right from the beginning was about making an end of rebirth. And we saw that even under his former teachers, he rejected the meditations that he was supposed to be practicing there because they lead to rebirth in those states, in the realms which correspond with those states of meditation. Just one detail of that is that the translation of that passage has often been translated in a way that doesn't make it 100% clear. One of the problems and one of the reasons why the suttas have been susceptible to readings that ignore or downplay the role of rebirth in them is because there's a lot of terminology in the suttas that does in fact refer explicitly to rebirth in many contexts, but the English translations of that don't really convey that. So, for example, the term vijnana, which we translate as consciousness, is closely connected with the idea of rebirth. In Thai, for example, a ghost is called a vinyan. Right? So that's the word vijnana, we translate as consciousness, is actually just the word for a ghost. Or I shouldn't say the word for ghost. Thai has many, many, many words for ghosts, but that's one of them. Another word is sankharas, which we translate as choices or activities or volitions or something like that. But sankharas is also used in the context of generating a wish or an aspiration to be reborn in a certain state. Bhava, which we usually translate as existence, sometimes mistranslated as becoming. If we heard the word bhava nirodha, the cessation of existence, we don't really think about rebirth, but this is what it means. Bhava nirodha means the cessation of getting reborn in these different states of existence. And in this context of the Buddha's former teachers, have another one of those cases where it says, what is it, yavadeva akinchaya yatanang upapattiya, and the term in Pali is upapattiya, often translated as appearing or arising or something like that. So arising in the realm of nothingness or appearing in the realm of nothingness or something like that. And in fact, it's a word that means to be reborn. So it doesn't mean just sort of appearing in this state, but it means to be reborn in that realm. Anyway, so yes. That means the realm of existence, the realm of bhava, that corresponds with that particular state of meditation. So you get into the formless realm, basically the dimension of nothingness, and then you get reborn after death in that space. Yeah? Yeah.
But if you don't believe in rebirth,
right?
or someone doesn't believe in rebirth, what is there about the idea of karma?
Well, exactly. You'd have to ask them about that, but this is one of the problems. It is a very central part of the teaching, and once you start pulling these bits out, then it's like you pull this thread out and it all starts to unravel. Yeah. I mean, obviously you can understand, much about karma from seeing how karma works in this life, but equally so, there seem to be a lot of really bad rich people, so it's kind of kind of problematic. Sorry, Caroline.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, you said you can be born in the realm of outer space?
No, you're born in the realm corresponding to that particular meditation attainment, which might be the realm, in that case, of infinite space.
Because I heard it wasn't very good to be born in that, because then you cannot meditate, and you're lost. So ignorance and being.
Oh, it's fine. Don't worry about it. This is kind of a piece of disinformation which is being spread by the proponents of certain meditation systems that shall remain nameless. However, what it says, the suttas actually address that point, as they do address most of these things, but the suttas address that point and said the difference between somebody who's a Buddhist practitioner and somebody who isn't Buddhist practitioner is that someone who is not a Buddhist practitioner will practice these things and then they'll come back and get reborn in this realm, whereas someone who is a Buddhist practitioner will get reborn in that realm and then they'll get enlightened from there.
So it doesn't matter in which realm you are.
Not really. Yeah.
Am I right to assume that Stephen Batchelor is one of those people who has this annoying point of view?
Would you be right in assuming, I'll just say it for the microphone, would you be right in assuming that Stephen Batchelor is one of the people that has this annoying point of view? Yes, I believe so, yeah. I haven't spoken with him recently about this, so I'm not sure if he still has that idea, but yeah, I did have a discussion with him a few years ago in Sydney. So, yeah. I was in the initial plans for this trip, I was actually going to be going and teaching at his place in France, but we couldn't work out the timing. And I said, we'll do some kind of dialogue or something like that. And he said, okay, let's have a talk about rebirth. And I said, Stephen, can we talk about literally anything else? Because this has been going on. Everyone knows what everyone thinks and stuff. I don't want to just hash it out again. There's other things to talk about, right? Anyway, Philip. Okay.
First two terms of the enlightenment.
Right. Oh, right. So yes, exactly. Right. Yeah. So Philip's pointing out that in the traditional account, the Buddha had the te vijja, the three knowledges, which the first knowledge is recollecting your past life. Second one is seeing how beings are born, pass away, and are reborn according to their karma. And then finally he was enlightened. So this again, of course, is another very prominent passage. Yeah. Yeah, couldn't agree more. Yeah, Hilda.
So when Buddha was born, he said it like, this is my last birth.
Exactly.
Whole life, during until he was going forth, he knows that he's going to be enlightened.
Did he?
Well, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah. Right. So the question is about, did the Buddha know that this was going to be his last birth? Now, we saw in the story about the Buddha's birth that he actually said that, right? So according to that sutta, as soon as he's born, that's the first thing he did, is stand on his two legs, take 7 mighty strides to the north and roar out with the voice of a bull, right? I am the first in the world, I am the eldest in the world, I am the greatest in the world. I mean, he's like, look out, Muhammad Ali, is what I can say. And then he's like, I am the greatest in the world. This is my last birth, right? And he declares that at that time. Now, my personal belief is that that's a legendary addition to the text. I don't really believe that he did that. But I wasn't there, so I can't prove it, but this is what I suspect. But generally speaking, I mean, in the Buddhist traditions, they have this idea that the Buddha or the Bodhisattva determined from long ago in his past lives that he would become enlightened in this lifetime. I mean, I don't want to go into it in too much detail, but that idea is not really found in the early texts. So the picture you get from the early suttas is really just that as we've seen, that the Buddha was born, or the Bodhisattva was born, he lived his life, had these experiences, decided to go forth, practice meditation, and then it realized enlightenment. And as part of that process, obviously, he learnt to recollect his past lives. Yeah. Caroline.
I also heard that Buddha is just, or is the name for enlightened person.
That's correct, yeah.
And Siddhartha was a personification of being a Buddha. And but there were also Buddhas before Siddhartha.
That's correct, yeah.
But that's eons and eons.
Yes. That's the general idea is that because being a Buddha is basically comes from being human, because you're just born and then you suffer and then you think, what's going on with this, and you understand it. So because it's a natural process to understand it, then the Buddha is not an individual, not a unique individual. He's unique in this particular context, but over a long period of time, then it's not unique. Yeah. How broad is the context? Well, I mean, according to the traditional interpretation, that this eon is what they call a fortunate eon, a Bhadra Yuga, and there are 4 Buddhas born in this eon. But often eons go past and there's no Buddhas in them at all. Some of those, the Buddha did talk about former Buddhas and did give some details of them, but most of the stories you hear about those are from later stories. Yeah. Well, again, I wasn't there, so yeah. Good.
Does it mean that it was predetermined that when he said, this is going to be my last birth, that he was kind of non-eternal and could do whatever was just happening?
Well, like I said, my personal belief is that this was added as a literary embellishment later on, but sure, if you believe it, that would be one interpretation of it.
If you're being non-eternal, then you can do whatever you like.
Well, I mean, the idea that the Buddha was enlightened or something in past lives, or even a stream enterer or non-returner or something, is rather difficult to square with a very well-attested fact that he spent 6 years practicing wrong view. Since that's the basic essence of being a stream enterer, is that you have right view and you understand what's the path and what isn't the path. Yeah. So clearly, everything in how the Buddha himself described his practice says he didn't know what he was doing. He thought this is what he was after, and he went and he tried these different teachings and practices because he thought that would work, and then figured out it doesn't work. And then all of these teachings like the Upakilesa Sutta and these kinds of things, again, it's not the way that that's described. It's not like there's this predetermined path that he's on, but it's that he's working things out as he goes. He was meditating, had this obstacle, and then he's like, what's the reason for this? And so it's about his practice. And to me, that Buddha is very inspiring. And I like my Buddhas human, personally. And I like a Buddha who was in the Bhairava Sutta, was sitting meditation in the forest, and then there was a crack of a twig in the forest, and he's like, what's that? And he got scared. And then he's like, oh, why am I getting scared? And that, to me, that's the Buddha I like. Yeah.
I think this might be connected to the question of free will and
right.
conditioned, or you have a free will and you can change it.
It kind of is, right? But I think in a more the story of the Buddha's birth is a myth, and as a myth, it operates according to mythic logic. And one of the fundamental principles of mythic logic is these things never were, but are always. So why are prophecies and predetermination and things like the chosen one and all of those kinds of things, why are these found constantly in mythology? because they're an outcome of the nature of the form. Because myths are told again and again and again, and you hear them again and again and again, and you've heard them through your life many times. And when someone's telling the story of the Buddha, you know that the Buddha's going to get enlightened. And every myth has that same kind of form, and that's why the knowledge becomes circular. Right? The myth is not there about revealing something that actually happens. It's not a linear process, but it's an embodiment of a cycle of things that are perpetually true and perpetually renewing themselves. So this is the fact that these things happen in that way is a manifestation of the process and the nature of mythological storytelling. Okay. Where are we? Okay. Rebirth. Okay. Right. Dhammapada. Okay, here we go. And so that was the first line of that verse. Oh, no, sorry. I apologize. We haven't finished the first line of that verse yet. So the first word is aneka jati, sort of countless rebirths. So the idea that the Buddha could recollect this ongoing process of rebirth. I've journeyed without reward, searching for the house builder. Painful is birth again and again. And so throughout this set of verses, the Buddha is using this metaphor of a house for rebirth. And this is an interesting metaphor, and it's one that's not just found in this particular case, but is constantly found when the Buddha is talking about rebirth. When he talks, for example, about the psychic ability to be able to see beings being reborn according to their karma, he describes it as like standing on the balcony of a house in a village and watching people walk out of one house, walk down the road, and walk into another house. The very word for what we would call a past life in Buddhism is a pubbe nivesa, literally a previous abode or a previous home. So this idea of the rebirth as being a house is a very common and very central metaphor for talking about the process of rebirth. And it's a metaphor that I think has some interesting implications. One of those implications comes up, and I'll just sort of talk about one of those implications because I think it's useful for understanding the question of the origin of life. Particularly, I mean, like the origin of an individual life when a woman gets pregnant. And so we have, of course, a very conflictive position these days where some people say that the life begins at conception, and that there's like a soul. So when the soul goes in, it begins at conception, and therefore an embryo, which is only a few hours old or a day or two old, is a human being with the same rights as any other human being, with the obvious consequence that with regards to abortion. On the other hand, then you have the materialistic point of view, which again has this idea that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of matter, so that consciousness can only be considered to appear when the brain has reached a certain level of complexity. And even though we can't necessarily determine that exactly, we can certainly say that it takes some period of time before the brain has reached a reasonable level of complexity, and so we can speak in a meaningful way about there being an independent being in the mother's womb with a individual moral value. So the idea of rebirth as being a moving house, I think, gives a very kind of illuminating perspective on that. Because the process of moving house is not a process that happens all at once. And see, people are always looking for black and white answers to these kinds of things. But do you think about it? What happens when you move house? Well, first of all, you think about it. Hey, I might move house. Then you start to look for a place. check out a few websites, see if there's anywhere vacant. You go and visit a place, visit a few different ones, see somewhere that you like, talk to the estate agent, then see if you can get the financing, right? And as that process is going along, you're gradually coming closer to that process, and eventually you make up a contract, you sign the contract, you move your things in. It might take weeks or months after signing the contract to actually move the things in. Then your financing falls through, and then you have to do it again, and so on and so forth. Then finally you move your furniture in, and then you move in to stay the night. You cross the threshold to spend the first night there. But then when you're staying there for the first night, you realize that you had forgotten to arrange to get the water and the electricity put on, so you can't actually stay there. So you have to go back to your old place and then get the water and electricity put on again, and so on and so forth. So the point is that moving into a home is not something that just happens at one point and then is not there the other point. It's a gradual process. And the critical thing about that gradual process is that how much do you suffer? Right? I mean, because you suffer through the whole process, right? But if that is to come to an end, right? If that process doesn't work, how much do you suffer? And the answer is, of course, well, it depends. I mean, and a general rule would be that the earlier in the process, then the less you're going to suffer. If you've been to visit a place, you like it, you make an inquiry of the estate agent, and the estate agent said, look, I'm sorry, I've already got another offer. Then you might say, oh, that's a bit disappointing. I like that place. And that's it. It's not such a big deal. On the other hand, if you've already moved in, you've got your furniture there, everything's there and everything's happening, and then you get a call from the bank to say, look, we can't get that loan that you're relying on, then you're probably going to suffer a lot. Yeah, especially if you've got rid of your old house already. Yeah. Yeah. So this, I think, is a nice analogy for that process of rebirth and for when conception takes place. At what moment does conception take place? Conception doesn't take place in a moment. Conception is a process which goes over a period of time, and there is an element of consciousness which is involved with that process, which is where it inherits the karma from the past life. But that the involvement of that consciousness and the degree to which that consciousness is invested in and attached to the new life is a gradual process. It's not just there one moment and not there the next. Just like any organic process. I mean, you could use the same thing for the idea of planting a tree. Right? I mean, I could put a little seedling in the ground and say, I'm going to plant a tree here. And then I think, actually, that's a bad place for it because it doesn't get the right sun. So I'll take the seed out and I'll put it somewhere else. Well, if I've just planted it there for a day or two, it's not going to make a big difference. If I planted it for a couple of years, it's going to be quite traumatic for the tree to move to a new place. So I would say this is a useful rule of thumb when considering the ethics of abortion and the ethics of terminating a life, is that from a Buddhist point of view, it's not an absolute and it's not a black and white. But if a woman has to make that decision, then she should it's better off to try to make the decision earlier rather than later. I should also say that, you know, I present this thing, or I say this thing from an understanding of Buddhist texts and so on, but I also think that it's past time when blokes stop commenting on women's right to have an abortion. Anyway, I was at a meeting in Sydney earlier in the year, and this bunch of old religious men were all objecting to the law which was going to be legalising abortion in Sydney. Okay, anyway, so this idea of going into a new home as being like an analogy for rebirth. And so the Buddha is celebrating the breaking and demolishing of this house. And the word that's used, I've translated as demolition, is visankhara. So sankhara, again, is found in dependent origination, is like the volition or the intention, the creative act that's building up these things. So visankhara, to demolish it, to undo it. And so...
Did you translate sankhara with demolition?
Visankhara is demolishing in this particular context. Visankhara is a negative form. Visankhara, yeah. So it's actually a very unusual form. It's only found in this context. Normally, one translation you could use for sankhara would be creation, or a creative force. So in this case, you could say, I've decreated it. But in English, of course, you'd rather say demolish, especially if it's regarding a house. Or deconstructed. Probably be better, wouldn't it? I've deconstructed it. Anyway. Yeah, Philip.
As you were mentioning technology before.
Yeah.
Technology evolved to a certain stage where the stream of consciousness
Right.
enters technology.
So could consciousness be reborn in a computer, is the question that you're asking. Yeah? More or less?
Sophisticated enough.
Yeah. Could you have an artificial form that's sophisticated enough? From a Buddhist point of view, there's no real theoretical problem with that. And I think that it's possible, but I really quite strongly believe that what we are doing today with computers has nothing to do with consciousness. And despite what all the futurists say, there's no way that we're just going to make faster computers and that somehow consciousness is going to pop out of the end of it. And I think that's absurd belief. I think that in principle that it's possible to have some kind of computing apparatus that might be able to be conscious, and that a being could be reborn into, but I don't think that's going to be anything like our current computers. There is no road from here to there. Perhaps quantum computers? Quantum computers are cool, if they can ever make them work. And quantum computers are nice because they're fuzzy. And fuzziness is an important characteristic of consciousness. So, maybe. But I don't think that we're ever going to get like a super fast chip and run a neural net on it, and somehow consciousness is going to pop out of it. Yeah. Yeah.
There are some views that even of death,
Yeah. Right. Yep. Ah. I don't think. I think it's possible. Yeah, the consciousness could hang around, but I don't think that is a reason to not donate your organs. I think we should donate our organs, and I have an organ donor card, or at least I used to. I lost my wallet, and I haven't replaced my organ donor card. But I should do that when I go back to Sydney, actually. So personally, I think it's a great thing to have an organ donor card. I know Ajahn Brahm has one. And most of the monks that I know have one. In fact, I also know there's a lot of monks who are donating kidneys even in this life. That's quite a lot of monks in Sri Lanka have done that. So, yeah, I wouldn't worry about it. You don't need them when you die. Yeah, I mean, look, that's part of the process of death anyway, right? I mean, it's normal when you die that your body decays, or that it gets, if there's an accident, it gets dismembered, or if you're sick, then maybe cancer or something has already damaged it. When your physical body is already damaged by that process anyway, so I don't think it's really going to matter too much. Yeah. If you think that the consciousness is still hanging around and it's going to be stressed by the whole thing, then you can do some metta, do some chanting, and try to calm the poor spirit down. I mean, that's what we do anyway, right?
Tibetan Buddhism very strict about it.
Yeah.
Say that it's not whatever leaves the body has to go through bond or it's very stressful.
Yeah. Is it? Yeah. So by default. Okay. Good. Yeah. They start demolishing the house, tearing the windows off, ripping the door down, selling them off. Yeah. Oh, I'm not dead yet. Yeah.
We find two kinds of suttas with a description about Dhamma, information, and one is with the Gandhava,
All right.
and the other is consciousness, like even kind of 50.
Right. Right.
And how do you integrate this?
Okay, so class is raising the point that in some cases where it talks about that which gets reborn, it uses the word consciousness, which is probably certainly by far the more common word and much more distinctively Buddhist. But occasionally you also find the use of the word Gandhava to describe the same thing. And Gandhava is an unusual term to use in that context because it's quite an animist sounding term. Gandhava normally refers to a class of celestial musicians who are basically the buskers and the musos of the heavenly realm. And the Gandhava Panchasika comes to the Buddha and in the Digha Nikaya and sings him a love song. Which is one of my favorite passages to translate in the whole of the suttas. How does it go? Something like, "Oh, maiden fair of thighs, your beauty to me is as delightful as the Dhamma is to the Arahants." So, yes, so then we have this term Gandhava, which is used. Actually, the Gandhava is only really used prominently in one passage. And what's often missed about that passage is in the Mahahatipatopama Sutta? Anyway, quite a major sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. And what's often overlooked is that the same passage is found elsewhere in the Majjhima Nikaya where it is spoken by some Brahmanical rishis. And it's a doctrine which is clearly in the suttas said to be a Brahmanical doctrine. So it would be, I think, another case where it's a kind of a pre-existing teaching which is taken by the Buddha and then adopted in that way. So for that reason, I wouldn't necessarily take the implications of the term Gandhava too seriously, that it's more just like an adopted term which is then applied in the Buddhist context. Yeah. Gandhava is actually a very interesting term etymologically. There was a book published about maybe in the 1950s or something called Buddhist and Vedic Studies by, who was it? I can't remember the name of the author. It was a fantastic set of studies, and it looked at a lot of the etymologies of some of these words. And it showed that even in the Vedas, that Gandharvas had these different kind of sets of connotations, that they were somehow associated with the spirit, that was associated with rebirth, but was also associated with musicians and things like that. And also interestingly, he suggested that the Gandharva is in Greek the Kantaura, which we know in English as the centaur. What's centaur? Can someone translate? Yeah. Yeah. Well, by mass. If we're going to be technical, it's important to be precise about these things, right? Yeah. Yes. Yes.
For brain death is when the cortex has died and deeper parts of the brain may still be active.
Okay.
And the idea is that when the cortex has died, there's no consciousness. So, how do we know that there's no consciousness when the cortex has died and then the deeper parts So, why is it stressful? We don't know.
Absolutely, yeah. We don't know. We don't know when consciousness goes in.
Pain.
Yeah. It's quite possible, yeah. And personally, if I think that consciousness has a close but somewhat loose and flexible relationship with the brain. So I don't necessarily think that it's possible to specify a particular moment when something happens to the brain that therefore there's no consciousness. In a case like that, really, you just have to use a rule of thumb. And if you're, for me, the thing is that if I'm at that stage, I'm fine, let me go. I don't want to hang around anyway. And, if there's some pain or some suffering for me at that point, then, well, that's all right, because I'm not doing it for me. I'm doing it because I want to help others. Yeah. But yeah, ultimately, you can't really know these things, and telling the time of death has been a very difficult thing for many years. In English they have the saying, saved by the bell. Yeah, in English they have the saying, saved by the bell. And so when we grew up, we thought that would apply to being in school, where you have in these really boring classrooms and listening to these lessons and the bell goes and like, saved by the bell. But apparently that's not the actual origin of the saying. The actual origin of the saying was that in England, a number of centuries ago, that for some reason they had to dig up the coffins in a certain graveyard. They were doing some building or development and they had to excavate the coffins. And when they did so and they opened the coffins, they found that a rather disturbing number of them had scratches on the inside. So they began to, they would put a string down when they buried them, and they would put a string with a bell on the top, so that if you'd been buried and you woke up, then you could pull the bell.
There are some people who suggest that when you are ready to make your organs, that you can say, I want to have narcose.
And I have a what?
Narcotics.
All right, yeah. Right.
So some people do. They
Right, just get me high and let me go. You just go out feeling good, yeah. Yeah. All right, so let's finish up by paying respects to the Triple Gem.